This is part 2 to the case of the missing Germans of Death Valley. I get sucked in. It never seems crazy at the beginning. I first came across the story of the missing Germans sometime in the summer of 2008. While romping around the internet between piano-playing cats and oceans of porn, I saw a reference to the tale on a Death Valley forum. It sounded interesting, so I googled a bit more and came across a report the CLMRG had done for their newsletter, The Talus Pile. The newsletter item laid out the basics of the case, but not much more. I was intrigued, but was quickly diverted by more piano-playing cats. Still, it remained in the back of my mind and was one of the two cases that got me seriously interested in the search and rescue field. The other was Steve Fawcett. After joining the Riverside Mountain Rescue Group, RMRU, in February of 2009, I actively began seeking out whatever training I could find. One opportunity I came across was a 2.5-day course on man tracking in Ridgecrest at the end of September 2009. I know man tracking sounds a bit ominous, but it just involves learning to follow the tracks of people rather than animals. That skill comes in handy in SNR operations. The class was being hosted by the CLMRG, and I knew a lot of their members would be in attendance. This was a great opportunity to ask more about the Germans' case. I had now been in search and rescue long enough to know that there are often details to incidents that don't make it into general circulation, and many times there is much more to the story. The missing Germans struck me as a case that simply had to have more to it. After making an inquiry or two, I was told, "Oh, you need to talk to Debbie Brittenstein. She's obsessed with it. She was on the original search and has all the background." In my world, obsessed is good, so this looked promising. Due to class activities, I wasn't able to connect with Debbie until almost the end of class, which was at the barbecue held at her home. Ever suave with opening lines, I think I started something to the effect of, "So tell me about the missing Death Valley Germans." Debbie at first appeared a little reluctant to get into the subject, as if she didn't want to dump an avalanche of information on me. But my obnoxious persistence and the thought that someone else actually was interested in the topic finally got her going. Beyond getting a much more detailed rundown of the incident, I found out two major points of information. The first was that Debbie had much of the original documentation of the search in her possession. The second was that, unlike many cases, there really wasn't more to it than met the eye. The basic information of the case I was already aware of was all there really was. This only added to the mystery. Debbie also mentioned the names of two private individuals who had performed some search and written report of their efforts, Emmett Harder and Dick Hasselman. She said she thought their reports might still be available online. Returning home, I swung into data collection mode. Ignoring my usual diversions of lolcats, I scoured the internet for even the slightest mention of the Germans, as well as the Harder and Hasselman reports. I was able to find a few bits, but the two reports I was after eluded me. Seeing Dick Hasselman being referred to as a retired professor from Virginia Tech, I was able to track down his university email and send him a query. After a bit of back and forth, he sent me a hard copy of his latest version. In terms of factual events, it displayed the accuracy typically seen in academic work, which was refreshing. And he had also spent considerable time interviewing the relatives of the Germans back in Germany, attempting to develop a profile of the group. This, however, left me a bit uneasy. It's well known in the SAR field that relatives are notoriously poor in describing even such simple things as what a subject was wearing when last seen. To ask them to describe a subject's state of mind or intent years after an event is just asking to be led down the wrong path. So while I found much of his work spot on, my experiences caused me to weigh the data points differently and ultimately found many of his conclusions improbable. Hasselman did bring up a couple of possible new clues I had not been aware of. First, there was a story of an individual on an ATV finding a couple of German canteens in an area described as being the midpoint of a straight line drawn between Sugarloaf and Needle Peak. This would have been about 3.5 miles southeasterly of the van's location. As riding an ATV off-road in a national park was not something authorities smiled upon, getting details of this alleged event was difficult. The second possible clue mentioned by Hasselman was that in the 3-month period between when the Germans apparently became stuck and when the van was discovered, a ranger on patrol about 18 miles to the south found an abandoned sleeping bag in the middle of a remote dirt road. As there was a sleeping bag from the van unaccounted for, could this possibly be connected? Unfortunately, not yet aware of the Germans, who were at the time missing in Anvil Canyon, DVNP disposed of the sleeping bag as trash, so it could never be examined as evidence. I found this second clue very intriguing due to a personal connection. Oddly, my wife Jerry and I had done a hiking trip in the very area the sleeping bag was found in March of 1996, only 4 months before the Germans became trapped. The road where the bag was found is rugged and extremely remote, ending at a microwave relay tower at time owned by AT&T. I knew the road and I knew the tower and thought it could have been a landmark a lost person might move toward. I also know there is nothing much else to be seen in the area, as it's against the northerly edges of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center boundary, and covering a straight line distance of 18 miles in the heat of July seemed highly unlikely. Tracking down Emmett Harder's report eventually led me to a visit to his home in Devore, California on October 21st. We spoke for almost 4 hours about the case, the people involved in the general area of Death Valley. He also provided me with a copy of his report, Cauldron of Hellfire, as well as a copy of the DV's investigator's report by Eric Inman, and several other useful documents. I asked him about the quote-unquote German canteen that Hasselman said were supposedly found to the south, between Sugarloaf and Needle Peaks. Harder had some detail on this, as well as knowing and talking to the motorcyclist who supposedly found them. But he didn't put too much weight on it, as the individual was unable to actually produce the canteens, and the responses were less than satisfactory in Harder's opinion. Further, Harder later found out that there was a food-water cache placed in the same general area for a group of long-distance hikers or survivalists traveling from Battle Mountain, Nevada to the Salton Sea. The party ended up missing their cache, and so it would have remained in place, and any canteens could have been related to that. During all this, I continued to pester Debbie for more information, and despite her work commitments, she obliged, and more data kept flowing my way. Incident logs, clue lists, all sorts of wonderful stuff. In reviewing it, I was impressed with the quality and thoroughness of the previous searching done by the various S&R teams. It became obvious to me that there were certain areas that, looking back in hindsight, could probably be excluded as they had been rigorously searched. Amazingly, this could be said of all of Anvil Canyon, most of Butte Valley, as well as Warm Spring Canyon. In essence, every place the Germans should have gone had been thoroughly searched with no trace found. This was certainly a strange case. Yet 4 people can't simply vanish into thin, if somewhat hot, air. This is probably the reason so many wild ideas as to their fate appeared over the years. The vacuum of solid information was slowly filled with wild speculation. Perhaps now might be a good time to list some of the ideas out there and editorialize a bit. Probably the most popular explanation as to what became of the Germans is that they staged the incident to disappear and start new lives. This was given some momentum by Egbert's ex-wife, saying that there were custody issues with their son. Also, co-workers of Egbert's stated he talked about moving to Costa Rica, which was rumored to have provided some sort of legal shelter if he brought his son along. As I said, this was a popular scenario. Even some SNR members and DVNP staff thought it was possible. But really, if you wanted to stage a disappearance, why do it in a dangerous and remote environment like Death Valley in summer? It could have been just as effective and much simpler to have done a thing while in Las Vegas. Further, Cornelia had a thriving business back in Germany which required her attention upon her return. She was in no position to vanish. Another idea floating around was that Egbert was intent on penetrating the China Lake NWC facility in the hopes of seeing exotic technology. There were a lot of vague, long-after-the-fact reports from relatives that he had heard of a very secret facility near Death Valley and was obsessed with finding out more. Further, he supposedly had some involvement in hybrid propulsion, whatever that means, and variants of this scenario either had the group forcibly conscripted into a black U.S. government program, or more sinisterly, they saw something they weren't supposed to see and were eliminated by U.S. government black world operatives. I suppose my background gives me the advantage of easily seeing the level of nonsense in this theory. I was quite involved in the amazing social fad of the mid-1990s that swirled around the facility at Groom Lake, better known as Area 51. I knew all the major players and spent considerable time unraveling many of its mysteries. Given that era and time, I am certain any reference to a secret facility near Death Valley, especially by a European, was a reference to Area 51 and not China Lake. No offense to China Lake, as I'm sure they have some rather interesting and overlooked things of their own, but there was nothing there to pull in tourists from Germany, and certainly nothing to be inadvertently observed that would make someone disappear. Further, my background also includes graduate work and research in what can be best labeled as exotic propulsion, including a few papers. So when someone starts tossing around phrases like hybrid propulsion, I'm qualified to weigh in. First, the phrase itself means nothing, but it suggests something exotic and otherworldly, which is probably the intent. But a Toyota Prius uses hybrid propulsion. Very cool, but nothing amazing. Further, investigating some of the names that Egbert was alleged to have worked with showed them to be designers of exotically styled automotive vehicles. Finally, if someone wanted to see China Lake facility and attempt to observe what was going on, there are far better and easier locations to do so. So the idea that the Germans were in that area at all to penetrate or observe the China Lake facility is fantasy. The last of the popular alternative theories as to what befell the Germans involved their crossing paths with some sort of criminal element. Some thought it could have been aging Charles Manson followers from the somewhat nearby Barker Ranch, or merely backcountry sociopaths. I have to admit, there is a possibility of this, but fortunately a very low one. The overwhelming majority of people who have made the effort to get into the backcountry are wonderful folks. This concept has the Germans crossing paths with one or more unsavory individuals being killed and their van dumped in Anvil Canyon to hide the crime, a very low one. The question one must immediately ask is, why? Egbert's bank accounts were left in the van and not taken. No activity was ever recorded on Cornelia's cards. The van was left locked and no other vehicle tracks were seen. Why wasn't the van taken? It would have been the most valuable thing the Germans had. And then there was the empty beer bottle found well downstream from the van's location. The searchers did spend a lot of time looking for something that could have been a grave but failed. Finally, while bad guys might not be the swiftest people in the world, why would they be hanging around the back country of Death Valley in summer? Of course, there are also the even stranger ideas like alien abduction. When people seemingly vanish into thin air, everybody jumps to blame the aliens. It appears to be the explanation of last resort and useful in almost any situation, but without going too far out on a limb, I think we could safely eliminate the possibility in this case. Given the lack of clues in the case, after time it became sort of a Rorschach test for searchers. People saw what they wanted to see as their minds attempted to form a conclusion. It's well known that the human mind desperately wants to connect cause and effect and will often craft answers when there are in fact none. I had now reached the point where I possessed all the information I was likely to obtain for the case. I had also spent many hours studying topo maps and Google Earth. I was beginning to seriously look at the area southerly of the van, primarily because it seemed to be the only area that hadn't been searched and the terrain didn't seem impossible. Problem was, there was no apparent reason for the party to head in that direction. The found beer bottles suggested they were headed eastward, toward the main valley. It was now time to head into the field and observe what things looked like for myself and see if there was any conceivable reason the Germans might want to have headed south. I decided on the perhaps not too bright course of action of making this a solo trip. I thought it important I see the area with fresh eyes, undistracted by company. My plan was to hike into Anvil Canyon and perhaps linger in the canyon until after dark, coming out via headlamp and camping in my truck at the trailhead. I thought this could be useful as the moon's phase and rise set times were similar to what was in effect when the Germans were there. I was interested to observe if there were any distant sky glows visible that could have enticed them to a specific direction, especially to the south. The next section is titled, A Pretty Stupid Day Hike. Let the adventure begin. On Tuesday, October 27th, I managed to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m., more asleep than awake. After the obligatory stop in beautiful Baker for gas and what passes for fine dining at a mini-mart, I made it to the head of Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. A couple of things struck me about the trip in. First, I was surprised at how long it took to get from the pavement of Badwater Road into Butte Valley. It was about 1.5 stinking hours with no stopping or sightseeing. Second, I was also impressed by how bad the road becomes at places after passing Warm Spring. These sort of observations were precisely the reason I wanted to do this first trip alone. I wanted to look at this as someone who had never seen it before, as the Germans had, and know what feelings and impressions I got. And the underlying impression was that this was one very remote place, and I haven't even left the truck yet. I started off from the truck and down Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. It was very windy and pretty cool, maybe 60 degrees. As I left the trailhead at Willow Spring, I noted there is no obvious way to know if there's really water present unless you go down and rummage through the bush. To a casual observer, it just looks like dense brush. On the way to the van's location, another observation. I was really amazed at how much burrow tracks look like human sneaker footprints. I could see how someone not knowing what they were could mistake them for fresh human tracks and maybe follow them. It appeared as if there was a deranged running club going up and down Anvil Canyon. Oh yeah, and I was struck by how sandy and loose the material was that comprised the road in the wash. Very easy to get a vehicle stuck. With the GPS coordinates, I made it to the van's location easily. There was a rock cairn present on the large rock near where the left front of the vehicle came to rest. I marked off the approximate outline of the van with flags and took photos to match those in the DVNP investigator's report. It was pretty obvious how they took a right fork when the road, such as it was, actually veered left and ended up in a no man's land. As I climbed up on the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot of the bank to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling. I continued on to the bottle site, which I started calling the bottle bush, coming across some old bones. They looked a bit large to be human, and I guessed burrow. I took pictures and coordinates, and the bones were later determined to be burrow. Finding the bottle bush was a little tricky. The coordinates I had from Debbie were rounded a bit, but close. I'd printed out the two poor B&W prints I had of the location and was able to line up the background hills for a good match. There was only about a 100-foot area along the wash where the topography lined up. If I had better prints, it would have been easy to find the absolute precise spot, but I was close enough. I did find what I thought to be the bottle bush, although the ground in front of it looked like it had been eroded a bit by flooding in the intervening years. I sat there a while and thought about where I was, what I was seeing, and took some panoramas of the view. The seating location obviously suggests shading from very late afternoon sun. Early in the day, it would have been in direct sun, so I think that puts a very general time of day on when it was used. At this point, the wind had picked up much more and the weather was getting colder and weirder. The main valley was dusty enough that I could not see past the mouth of Anvil Canyon in the distance or to the other side of the main valley. There was a really milky-looking overcast that left me with an ominous feeling. Looking at the time, I was thinking I wouldn't be able to make it southerly past Squaw Spring, as I would have liked, and still made it back to truck by 5. I had already decided I didn't want to be out hiking in Anvil Canyon after dark, as there wouldn't be much of a moon with the overcast. Also, being there solo, the history of the place and the weather was making all things more than a bit creepy for me. I decided I had time to poke around a bit more down Anvil Canyon, then up to Squaw Spring. My map showed an old road that ran from Anvil Canyon southwest up to Squaw Spring. As I traveled easterly down Anvil Canyon, I was looking for anything that might have enticed the Germans to head south. For most of the route, that way was blocked by mountains, but near the bottle bush the topography to the south opened up, and I knew that Squaw Spring was up there somewhere. Having seen the burrow tracks, I was assembling a marvelous scenario in my head where the Germans had also seen them and been led astray. My brilliant theory was that when they got to the bend in the road shown on my map that turns back to the right and heads southwesterly up to Squaw Spring, they may have seen burrow tracks heading up the road to the spring and, thinking they were human, followed them to the south. Of course, I knew that CLMRG had returned to the areas on a later search and thoroughly explored the Squaw Spring area without luck. But I put that thought aside and was quite proud of my idea. Sadly, that idea was dashed when I reached the road bend. I use the term road in the loosest sense. The road up to the right was so faded it was almost invisible. I had it shown on my GPS map, which saved me. And it was so rocky that it couldn't possibly been burrow tracks. Nevertheless, I started up the road, climbing the alluvial fan toward Squaw Spring. Looking south, at this point, I couldn't think of any conceivable reasons they would have been drawn in that direction. While the terrain to the south looked milder, there was no obvious attraction to proceed that way. As I reached the ridge opposite Squaw Spring, which was nothing more than a clump of green on the hillside, it was almost 3 p.m. and time to get the hell out of Dodge, so I really didn't get to poke in the shrubs at all. But as with Willow Spring, this was a case of not seeing obvious water. Now, the quote-unquote road to Squaw Spring makes almost a 180 bend, so you end up going east down Anvil Canyon a ways, then backtrack up to Squaw Spring. To save distance and get out of this crazy place as quickly as possible, I decided to save time and just head cross-country almost straight back to the van, cutting off maybe 1 to 1.5 miles, and lots of walking in sand. It was an adventure, going up and down through ravines, and I saw some interesting stuff I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I came across a nice 50 caliber shell casting from 1943, a sure sign that I'm in way out of place. I found a great many of those out in the desert. By now the wind was howling, not quite yet bad enough for goggles, and the temperature had dropped to the mid-50s. I got back to the truck around 4:40 p.m., after covering a total of just over 12 miles for the day. As there was still light for about another hour, I decided I'd just try for home rather than spend a night with the truck rocking in the wind, not to mention being a little relieved to return to civilization and away from this god-awful place. I managed to get home just after 10 p.m., more than a little tired. 10 hours driving and almost 7 hours hiking. Sadly, I've done stupider things and I would yet to do worse. So having seen the spots and soaking up the ambiance, I began dwelling on the problem, trying to come up with a scenario that reasonably fit what was known about the case and as a bonus, might just make some sense. On October 29th, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes, and why they might have set out for the south. I was also acutely aware that I may have done exactly the same thing were I in their situation. Is this, in fact, what happened? No one can know for sure, but it offered an explanation for their apparent actions and fits the known facts of the incident very well. The next section is a slightly edited down version of an email I sent out to several interested parties on October 29th.